Our next video is still Christ in 1 Peter, and we're almost there. We're in chapter 5, the last chapter of the first letter of Peter to the Christians. Peter is clearly writing to Christians who are suffering, and in the context of today's verse, the church was the persecuted church and in need of strong leadership. But I suppose it's very different from the Western world, and pretty much in Africa and Asia it's very different even for Christians today. Leaders are often the target of persecution. They're often the target of false accusations, being thrown into prison. And to be a leader at any time is difficult, but especially in the persecuted church is even more difficult. And so what was needed for the spiritual leaders in the church, and is still needed today in a different way across the world, is encouragement. And that's where today's verse comes in. Chapter 5, verse 4 of 1 Peter. Christ, our chief shepherd. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the crown of glory that will never fade away. Think about a church that has lost maybe some of its leaders to persecution, to prison, maybe even to death. What would be the encouragement to keep going for the Christians and for the leaders of the church and maybe future leaders? The encouragement would be that, as this verse says, that Christ is our chief shepherd, and it says, you will receive the crown of glory. Here we see that Christ is the chief shepherd, the supreme guide and guardian over God's people. He's the one that's going to come in the future day. When he appears, Christ will appear in glory, and he will give unfading crowns to the faithful. In other words, Jesus Christ is going to reward those faithful leaders for their leadership that has been done of the model of Christ. The crown here is a Stephanos, from what we get the name Stephen from. It's a victor's wreath, often awarded to athletes. Here this is symbolic of eternal reward, and the emphasis on the eternal reward. And unlike earthly glory, this crown is unperishable, untouched by time or decay, unlike the victor's crowns that were given to the athletes for their success. Let's remember for every shepherd that Christ is the chief shepherd. Psalm 23 verse 1, most well-known psalm, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. John 10:11, Jesus Christ said, I am the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. Christ as a shepherd is sacrificial. Hebrews 13 verse 12, the Lord Jesus is described as the great shepherd of the sheep. And 1 Corinthians 9:25 speaks about the crown. Paul speaks about they do it to get a crown that will not last. That's an earthly crown. But we do it to get a crown that will last forever. And so Christ leads, he guides his people with truth and grace. He feeds, he nourishes with word and spirit. These are all implied in the word that Christ is the chief shepherd. He guards, he protects from false teaching and temptation, and he rewards, he honors faithful service with eternal glory, or the enjoyment of eternal glory. But of course, as believers, we're living under not just the chief shepherd, Lord Jesus, but also those spiritual leaders in our churches. And we see in these verses, 1 Peter 5, particularly verses 2 to 4, that spiritual shepherds are to follow his voice and example. They are to serve willingly and faithfully in the roles and in the work that God has given them, and to have the hope in the crown of unfading glory. All earthly shepherds, pastors, elders, whatever term you want to use, serve under his authority. Faithful leaders and believers alike will be publicly honored. The crown is not for this world, but for faithful service in the next. And Christ shepherding and caring for his people is personal, present, and eternal. And so we are on the shepherds themselves, are under the chief shepherd and the flock, of course. Our service is not meaningless because Christ will reward every faithful service for spiritual shepherds. And of course the same is true for us in our Christian life. It talks about the crowns, a crown of life, a crown of righteousness, crown of life, Revelation 2, crown of righteousness, 2 Timothy chapter 4, and there are other crowns, crown of rejoicing, 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, and all these crowns are, the other ones that we mentioned are for believers, for specific aspects, and this crown, the crown of glory, is specifically for spiritual shepherds who follow the example of Christ and shepherd God's flock, that is the local church. But remembering that it's God's flock and they're accountable to the chief shepherd. Matthew Henry said, to finish, the crown that Christ gives is not of gold, but of glory, not corruptible, but everlasting, not for the proud, but for the faithful. Thank you for listening.